It's fascinating how companies are paying so much attention to corporate social responsibility these days.
Yeah.
But I feel like what we don't always hear about is how employees actually experience these initiatives,
Hmm.
especially during times of like upheaval like the pandemic was.
Right, right.
And that's kind of what we're going to try to unpack a bit today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one thing for companies to do good, but it's
Yeah.
another thing for those actions to resonate with their employees.
Total. And like we all remember, I think, Amazon's big push into grocery delivery during COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And on the surface, essential service keeps people safe, seemed like a win-win.
Yep.
But then when you look at how employees reacted, protests, safety concerns, even some pretty high-profile resignations, it kind of paints a different picture, right?
Yeah, it really highlights a crucial point, I think, that CSR isn't just about the action, but it's about how that action is perceived by the people who are actually enacting those things, right?
Exactly.
And that's why we're taking a behavioral lens today, looking at how employees respond to different types of CSR.
Okay, so I guess for anybody listening who needs a quick reminder,
Mm-hmm.
CSR basically boils down to companies going beyond just profits and doing things that benefit society or the environment.
Exactly.
Right, we're talking like social impact, sustainability, all those good things.
Yeah, all those good things, ethical practices. But I think for a long time, CSR research was very much focused on the company.
Yeah.
Like, does this improve their image? Does this affect their bottom line? All very company-centric perspectives.
Right, like is this good for business?
Exactly.
But more recently, there's been this real shift towards a more person-centric view, I think, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. We're now asking, how does this affect individuals within these companies? How does it affect your experience as an employee? And this is where this idea of micro CSR comes in, which really is taking that perspective of the individual.
Yeah, it's like zooming in on the actual human experience, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Zooming in on what's happening at the ground level.
And I think this is especially crucial in times of crisis, right? Like we saw with the pandemic,
Right.
when there's so much uncertainty and people are really trying to find meaning in their work.
Absolutely. And I think that's a nice segue into this really interesting distinction that has come out in the literature between embedded and peripheral CSR.
Okay, so tell me more about this.
Yeah.
This sounds interesting.
So, with embedded CSR, think about social responsibility as being sort of woven into the fabric of a company, right? So it's not just a separate department or a one-off campaign. It's really part of their DNA.
So it's reflected in like their core competencies, their daily operations,
Exactly.
where they make decisions, kind of everything.
Everything they do, yeah. And a good example of this is Intel. Their commitment to enriching lives goes way beyond just philanthropy. It's really integrated into their performance reviews.
Wow.
Their compensation structure, even their engineering decisions.
Even their engineers are thinking about social impact.
Yeah.
That's pretty wild.
It really is. It's a deep level commitment to these ideas. Now, contrast that with peripheral CSR, where the actions themselves are good, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they're not fundamentally connected to the operations of the business. So think donations, sponsorships, volunteer programs, those kinds of things.
Okay, so bring it back to Amazon for a second.
Okay.
It sounds like their grocery delivery expansion could have been embedded.
It could have been, but the way they went about it felt very detached from employee well-being, and I think we saw that play out, right? Concerns about worker safety were addressed, and ultimately it felt much more like a peripheral initiative.
Right.
And this is a really important distinction because research has shown that the two approaches can have drastically different effects on employees.
So are you saying embedded CSR is the way to go?
Well, let's dig into that a little bit more.
Okay.
What's fascinating is that embedded CSR is much more likely to lead to positive employee outcomes. So think engagement, purpose, finding meaning in work.
Because they can see how their daily tasks are contributing to something bigger than themselves.
Exactly. And there's evidence for this. For example, when Intel responded to the pandemic, they didn't just give like a one-time donation.
Right.
They provided $60 million in tech support to communities, $100 million to support their own employees. And these actions that were very much aligned with their mission actually led to employees then coming up with more CSR initiatives.
Wow, so it's like a positive feedback loop.
Exactly.
That's awesome.
But what happens when those good deeds maybe aren't so good? What happens when maybe employees feel like it's just for show? This is where we get into peripheral CSR.
Oh, okay, interesting.
So think about it. Have you ever been asked to do something at work that just felt disingenuous or inauthentic?
Oh, yeah,
How
like
did
it
that make you feel?
makes you feel kind of icky,
Well,
like you're being used.
exactly. And the research supports this, right? Studies have shown that employees can be turned off by CSR if they suspect it's just for PR.
So it's like when Jeff Bezos made that $100 million donation to food banks during the pandemic,
Right.
which on the surface, very generous, sounds great.
Yeah, huge donation.
Right.
But a lot of people saw it as a way to deflect attention from all the criticism that Amazon was receiving about worker safety.
Right. It's all about perception, right?
Yeah, it's all about perception and how these things are perceived. And so even a seemingly positive action like that can backfire if it's not perceived as authentic.
So it's not just about the action, it's about the intent behind it,
Exactly.
about how that's perceived.
Exactly. And this brings us to this idea of sense making, which I think is so critical in understanding all of this.
Okay, sense making, break that down for me.
All right, so sense making, think about it as how we as humans try to make sense of the world, right? Especially when things are confusing, uncertain.
Like during a global pandemic.
Yeah, exactly. Like during a global pandemic, there's all this uncertainty, and we're trying to figure out what's going on, what does this mean, how does this affect me? So we're constantly trying to make meaning of our experiences. And this relates to CSR in a really interesting way.
Okay, I'm listening.
So think about it. Work is such a huge part of our lives, right? We spend so much time at work, it's natural for us to want to find meaning in it.
We want to feel like what we're doing matters.
Exactly. We want to feel like we're contributing to something bigger than ourselves.
Right, like we're making a difference.
Yeah, and that's where CSR comes in. It can be a really powerful way for employees to find that meaning if it's done right. But to understand why that is, I think we need to dig a little bit deeper into the psychology of sense-making.
So, okay, let's unpack this sense-making thing a little bit.
Okay.
You're saying it's about how we interpret our experiences.
Yeah.
Especially in times of uncertainty.
Hmm.
But how does that relate to how employees react to CSR?
Well, imagine you're working at a company
Okay.
and they launch some big CSR initiative. Right.
How do you as an employee make sense of that? Do you see it as genuine? Does it align with your values? Or does it feel like, I don't know, like a PR stunt?
Right. Yeah. Like, are they just trying to look good or are they actually trying to do good?
Exactly. Exactly. And I think that's where the difference between embedded and peripheral CSR becomes really critical.
Okay.
Remember, embedded CSR is like woven into the fabric of the company.
Mm-hmm.
So when employees see their company living out their values
Yeah.
in a way that's consistent with their own beliefs,
Mm-hmm.
that can create a really powerful sense of meaning and purpose.
They feel like they're part of something bigger.
Exactly. It's not just meaning at work, you know,
Yeah.
like I'm proud of the company I work for.
Yeah.
It's meaning in work.
Mm-hmm.
Like the actual tasks I do
Right.
contribute to this larger purpose, and that can lead to greater engagement, motivation.
Right. They actually feel good about going to work
Exactly.
and doing their job.
But with peripheral CSR, that connection might be missing.
If the company is just, I don't know, making a one-off donation
Right.
or sponsoring an event,
Mhm.
employees may not see how their work contributes to that.
Exactly. It feels very separate.
Exactly, and that can lead to skepticism, disengagement. They may even start to question the company's motives, like, why are they doing this?
So going back to Amazon,
Okay.
could it be that, part of that negative reaction that we saw was because employees didn't feel involved in the grocery delivery expansion?
Yeah.
It was kind of like, this is good for the world, now go make it happen, without really considering how it impacted their own work lives, right?
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I think the research would suggest that employee involvement is really key for successful CSR implementation. When employees are involved in shaping these initiatives,
Yeah.
implementing them,
Right.
they feel a sense of ownership,
Uh-huh.
which leads to buy-in and better outcomes.
So maybe if Amazon had involved their workers more in the planning and the execution,
Yeah.
they could have addressed those safety concerns early on
Mm.
and maybe created a win-win for everybody.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there are very practical ways to do this. I mean, companies can incorporate CSR goals into their performance management systems.
Oh, interesting.
So employees are actually rewarded for contributing to these goals. Or you can even think about compensation structures that incentivize employees to develop more sustainable practices,
So it's not just about doing good, it's about actually integrating it into
Yeah.
how the company functions
Into how the company operates.
on every level, yeah.
At every level, exactly. And this brings us back to this power of sense making. When CSR is embedded, it helps employees make sense of their work in a way that feels authentic and meaningful.
Hmm.
It reinforces the belief that they're contributing to something positive, something bigger than themselves.
And that can be really motivating,
Absolutely.
right? It can make people actually want to go to work and do a good job.
Mhm. Absolutely. And that's what makes this behavioral perspective so valuable because it allows us to go beyond just the surface level of doing good deeds and really understand how this impacts people's lives.
Right, the actual people doing the work.
The actual people, the people on the ground making these things happen.
Right.
So, yeah, I think it's a really powerful lens.
So it's not enough to just check boxes
No.
and, issue a press
Right.
release. Companies really need to create a culture where social responsibility is truly ingrained
Yes,
in everything they do.
100%.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
We talked about what CSR is. We talked about this behavioral lens and why it's so important, the difference between embedded and peripheral CSR. We've even explored this idea of sense-making
Yeah.
and how it helps us understand, what it's actually like to be an employee in these situations.
Yeah. What's it like to be on the ground? How are people making sense of this?
I feel like we're really at this turning point in how we think about CSR.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too.
We're moving beyond just doing good to thinking about like the actual impact on people
Yeah.
and how are they experiencing these things.
Yeah, the people who are making it happen.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's so important because ultimately, employees are the ones that are bringing these initiatives to life.
They are the ones that are interacting with customers. They're making decisions every day.
Oh.
They're shaping the culture of the company.
So if they don't buy into it, it's probably not going to work.
Exactly, exactly. And I think that's why it's so crucial for leaders to think about CSR as not a program or initiative, but something that's like integrated into the organization.
Okay, so how can they do that?
Yeah.
Like, what are some practical steps?
Yeah. So I think one really key step is involve employees in the process from the very beginning.
Okay.
Ask them what issues they care about, what causes they're passionate about.
Because if they feel like they have a voice in shaping the strategy,
Exactly.
they're going to be more invested in it.
Absolutely. And it's not just about soliciting input. It's about giving employees the opportunity to like own those initiatives.
So like instead of having like a top-down volunteer program,
Yeah.
maybe create some kind of structure where employees can propose and lead their own projects.
Exactly. Exactly. And also I think it's really important to align those initiatives with the values of the company.
Yeah, because if there's that connection, between the mission and
Right.
the actual CSR efforts,
Yeah.
it's going to feel more authentic.
100%. It's going to feel more meaningful. And don't forget about recognizing and rewarding employees.
Right. Celebrate the successes.
Exactly. Make sure people feel appreciated for the effort they're putting in. And by taking these steps, I think leaders can create a culture where CSR is not just something you do, but something you are.
Yeah, and that's where the magic happens.
That's where the magic happens.
Well, this has been such a great deep dive. I've learned so much.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting conversation.
So as we wrap up today, what's like one key takeaway you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the one key takeaway is if you really want to create change through CSR, look inward first. Like, don't just focus on the deeds. Focus on how you're doing business.
Because at the end of the day, it's the people inside the organization who are going to determine whether it works or not.
Yeah, the people on the ground, the people in the offices, they're going to be the ones who are ultimately making the decisions.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us
Yeah, thanks for having me.
on this deep dive into the behavioral side of corporate social responsibility.
It's been a pleasure.
Hopefully everybody listening found it as insightful as I did.
Yeah, definitely food for thought.
And we hope to see you next time for another deep dive.